Howdy folks. Today we're going to take a look at routes, backend routes, and Express specifically. Um, so in order to get started, let's take a look at the structure that you'd usually do. And this is a structure I usually do, so your structure may vary a little bit. So I've got my blank folder here, right? If I'm going to open a terminal, and then let's run npm init to create our package.json file. So we're going to need that. All right, so now we have our package.json. And so what we're going to do next is create a folder to store our code in. So what I normally do is I normally call this src, which is short for source. And then inside that directory, I'll make two more. One of them will be front end, and the other will be back end. That's not where I want that. So now we have a front end, we have our back end. Let's do a really quick front end. Make our index.html. And then let's do this. Let's add the ability to create a user and do some user login, just so you can kind of see the full stack of how we're doing this. So ID equals login. Please log in, or create user. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have another section. Type equals text equals username. Input type equals password equals password. All right, and then let's put some labels on that. Label, username, label, password. Okay, then let's put some buttons on here. And button, this is going to be login button, and then I want another button for create user. Let's give these some IDs. Login button and ID equals create user button. All right, and then let's just open this in our browser. Okay, that's fine. I actually want to put a break line in here to make some space. All right, very simple login, right? Which is totally fine. I'm not doing the form for this. If you had a form, you could make that work. So let's hook up one of these buttons. Let's make ourselves our script. And then let's import our script at the bottom of the body. Source equals JS type equals text JavaScript. And that. And let's just make sure it works. Log. Bring up our inspector, our console, reload. We see our console log. That tells us that our script is properly hooked up to the HTML because this runs. All right, so we've got our create user button. Let's do that first. Let's say document.getElement by ID. User button, add event listener, click. And okay, so inside here, we got to pull out our username. .getElement by ID, username, value. Not that. Value. Okay, same thing for password and password. And then let's just console log these just to make sure we did everything correctly. All right, reload this, type some gibberish in here, type some gibberish in here, create user, username, password. Cool. So what do we want to do here? When we get the username password, we actually want to create the user. So we're going to do that with a fetch request. So fetch. What's our URL going to be? Normally it would be something like HTTPS, some domain, API, my API. In this case, we don't actually need this domain because the reason is, or I guess we do, but basically this domain is going to be our local computer. So let's change this to localhost. You notice I'm changing this from HTTPS to HTTP. That's simply because my localhost is not running on a secure port. It's running on an insecure port. So API, let's leave that in. And then let's just say user, right? Then we'll put some options. Method, post. Why are we doing method of post? Because if you're doing creation, generally that creation is a post method. And that's just the method that we use for making new objects. So we want to stick to that format. So then we have to pass our body. Okay. So if we pass our body, name, password, like that. And so we're basically just building an object using these as key and value at the same time. Let's see what that does. If I now put some stuff in here, I go to my network tab, make sure fetch XHR is clicked because we're doing a fetch request, and I click create user. It's going to fail right off the bat, but let's just make sure our payload looks good. It does not. Object, that's because this needs to have a string, not an actual object. And then the other thing we need here is we're going to need a header to let the system know what type of data we're sending. That header is going to be content type. And what that tells our backend is it tells the backend, hey, this is a string. I know we're giving you a string, but I need you to treat this as if it's JSON. So the way we do JSON is we pass application JSON as the header. Okay, so let's run this. Create user. It's still going to fail, but now you can see we have the right request payload in here because we stringified it. We look at our headers. Our request headers now has that content type in here, and that's fine. So now let's build a backend that listens to this because we're just going to localhost, which is our current computer. So this is just a very simple way. This is how we call it on the front end. Let's do it on the back end. So we open up our backend folder. I'm going to create another, you can call it whatever you want. I like to use index.js just because I'm used to that. Another common one is server.js since this is technically the backend. So what's the first thing we need to do in our backend? Well, we actually need to install Express. So we're going to open up a terminal and we're going to say install Express. If you need to put a certain version, you can put it in here. You notice I'm using pnpm. The reason is because pnpm doesn't re-download packages every single time, so it's a little faster. If you're using npm, it'd be the same command, just npm. All right, so now we have our package JSON contains our Express dependency. We now have node modules, which you can see in here. I'm actually going to go ahead and make now a .get ignore. That is going to ignore node modules just because we don't want to push it up. And so what do we do from this point? We need to import Express. Where? Express. Next thing we need to do is we need to actually create our application server. So Express by default, you can pull it in, but it doesn't just magically make everything work. We have to create an app. So we do that by calling Express as a function. This creates a brand new app that we can now use to do various things on. So the next thing we need to do with the app is we need to define an API. So let's actually put these side by side. We've got our API here. Everything after the host is going to be the API. So this /API/user is our path. So we have to define an API. The way we do that is we say app dot, and then you notice they have a bunch of functions here. Whatever function you call is going to be whatever method you're using. So I use post here. So I say app.post, and that's a function, okay? If it was a get method, I'd use app.get. If it's a delete method, I'd use app.delete. So app.post, then what I need is I need two parameters. First one is going to be the actual path. or argument, sorry, the path that we're giving for this API. The path, remember, is what comes after the host here. So I'm going to put that in here. API/user, API/user. It hooks up exactly the same. The next one is going to be a function. And we'll go over what that does in a little bit, but for now, I'm just going to post called post user. Just put a console log there so we can see that it's doing something. Okay, the final thing we need to do is we need to actually start listening. Once we've done this here, we've created the application, we've set up a route on it or an API on it. We haven't actually told it to start listening for connections. So we do that with app.listen. This also takes some parameters. The first one is the port to listen on. Now, what is a port? A port is a specific, almost like a door in your computer. There are quite a number of them, thousands in fact, and when a process wants to start listening for outside connections, it opens a door. Only one process can listen at each port at one time, which means we want to pick a port that isn't being used already. I'm just going to pick, 3001. It's a good port. Not a lot of things use 3001. So we do have an optional parameter here, a second parameter. It's a callback function. What this callback function is called when the app finishes setting up and is ready to listen. So we can actually log here. App is now ready for connections on port 3001. All right, so let's open up our terminal. And let's run node source backend index.js because we're at the base level and we need to go into source, into backend, and run this file. You can see pretty quickly it says app is now ready for connections on port 3001. Great. We come back here. Let's clear this. We create our user again. And it didn't do anything. Why didn't it do anything? Well, we're not listening on the same port. This is actually listening on localhost 3001. So we need to go up here and put a port there. By default, browsers go to port 80 if you don't specify a port. That's a very common HTTP port. That's what they listen on. Or if you're using HTTPS, they will go to port 443 because that is the default secure HTTP port. Ours is running on port 3001 because we put that in here. So we have to put that with a little colon after the host name so that our browser knows to hit that. All right, let's try that again. All right, now we get something that says, hey, this doesn't seem right. This is a CORS issue. And you can see if we close here, this says, hey, status, CORS error. What is a CORS error? Well, what the browser does is it tries to do secure for us. It tries to make sure that we can't call APIs if we don't have permission to call those APIs, if we're in the wrong domain. Right now, my domain is actually this particular file. It's not localhost. So this is getting kind of confused. So what we can do with this is there's actually a CORS middleware that we can use. So the first thing we need to do is actually install that middleware. So I'm going to look at my server here. I'm going to hit Control-C, and that's going to cause it to quit. It won't quit until you do that. And then I'm going to install CORS. Oops, two L's. CORS. Just like that. Then at the top of my server, I'm going to require it. CORS. And then I'm going to actually tell the app to use it as a middleware. We'll get into this a little bit more. But basically what this does is this .use says every single request that hits this server is going to pass through this function first, the CORS function. So let's take a look at what that does. The first thing we need to do is restart our server. So we pull up that source backend index.js, run that. It again says ready for connections. So we're going to open up this. We don't need to reload this page because we haven't actually changed anything on the front end. We've only changed the back end. If I call create user again, you see now called post user. This console log happens because it matched that post and that API here. And if you go here you can see it says pending. We haven't gotten a response yet from the server. So let's take a look at why not. The server will basically wait for quite some time as soon as you call this function, because it assumes that you may have kicked off some asynchronous process, something that uses a promise. You may have gone to a database. You need to be maybe waiting for a file to load. So it's not going to make any assumptions that just because you got to the end of this function, you're done. So we have to tell it that we're done. How do we do that? Well, that gets into the parameters to this callback here. There's the request and the response, usually abbreviated as REQ and RES. The request contains a bunch of data about the actual request, the URL that was hit, any headers that were passed, for example, this content type header, the request body, any query parameters. The response provides a bunch of methods that we can use to actually send data back up to the browser, which is what we want to do in this point. The most simplest one is just end. What does end do? That tells Express that we're done here. You don't have to keep waiting. You notice this is still pending. It is still pending because it's still waiting for the server to say, hey, I'm done. This res.end is what tells it, hey, I'm done. So let's kill that server and restart it. Now, if I call create user, you can see it immediately gives a 200 response. Oops. And there's no response because we didn't actually give any data, but it gets a 200 OK and it doesn't say pending. It says, hey, we're done. We finished. That's because of that res.end. That tells it we're good. So next thing we want to do, because this is a post request, we want to access the body. We want to access this data that we passed in. Okay. How do we do that? Well, in order to do that, we actually need another middleware. Why do we need a middleware? Because Express doesn't make any assumptions about what your body is. We need to tell it specifically that, hey, this is JSON data. Okay. How do we do a middleware? We call app.use. Our middleware in this case is going to be express.json. What this does, this is a function that tells Express whenever it gets any request, it's going to check it and say, is this a post request? Okay, if it is, what is its content type? Is it an application JSON? If it is, then it's actually going to process this body appropriately. What does that mean? That means that we can actually console log rec.body. And I'll show you what happens if we get rid of this JSON. Okay, so we're going to start this again. We're going to create our user. And now you can see, here's our body. This matches the body that we passed. What if we take this out? Okay, we take it out, start it again, call this. Body is now undefined because Express wasn't able to process the body because we never used any of the middleware for body processing. So let's put that back in. Imagine if we took this out on the client. Okay, so we removed our content type header. We're going to restart this, put in a bunch of stuff here. We got to restart our server too. Remember, for each time I'm hitting Control C and then just running that command again, that node command. Create user, and you can see now we get this, we have this payload still in here, but now our backend isn't recognizing it. It's giving us an empty object because we didn't put the content type in. We didn't put the content type in, which means that this middleware couldn't recognize it. So both of these things need to be in there, the header and the middleware, and that's how you get a body for your user, for your post request. All right, so let's destructure this. Password equals rec.body. So what are we going to do here? I want to do something simple. I want to make a data folder. Okay. Just put it here. I'm going to put it in our git ignore. And then I'm going to put a file in here called users.json. And this is just going to be a simple, let's do a list of users. We're not going to do SQL for this yet because that's a little bit more complicated. But for now, we're just going to be storing this to a file here. So username, password. When we're saving a user to our list, we want to do a couple things. Get the list of existing users, check that our new user doesn't already exist. Write the new user to the list of users. Actually, let's say append there. And then write the new list of users back to the file. So let's start off with the first one of those. We're dealing with files, so we want fs, the file system. This is something we don't have to install. It comes naturally with Node, so we're just good to have it right there. Get the list of existing users. Existing users equals fs.readFileSync. Then we need our file path. So I'm just going to say here, this is up a directory, up a directory. So now we've gone from backend, source, and now we go data, users.json. Okay, let's just console log that to make sure that we're working here. Okay, we run that. Call create user again. Ooh, that doesn't work. No such file or directory. All right. Well, what that means then, we're actually just going to have to figure out a path because I think it doesn't like this. So let's pull in the path module and let's make a variable up here. Let's call it users data file. Resolve. What are we doing here? Dir name is the current directory that the file is in. So that would be this source backend. So I'm saying from here, you notice I'm making these separate arguments instead of putting the slash because the path command puts the slash for you. So I'm going to go up one to source, up one here into data and users.json. So let's try putting this in here instead. And then actually our second parameter needs to be UTF-8. So it actually gives us stuff. Control C, run it again, create user. Now, okay, now we get that. But the thing is, this is a string. This is not an actual object. We need to turn this into a string first. So I'm going to put string on that. Existing users equals json.parse existing users string. Okay. Run it again. Okay. No difference, but now it actually represents a JSON array. Check that our new user doesn't already exist. For that point, we need to find existing user equals, and we can actually say, we can do a find. There's a find command. It passes a callback that you basically return true or false if this object matches. So what we're going to do is we're going to return user, dot username equals username. And so what that's going to do is that's going to say, okay, of my existing users, if we have any user where their username equals the username that was passed in the body, then we're going to return that user. If existing user, what do we do in this case? In this case, we want to do something, but we won't do it yet. Log error user exists. We'll get to that because right now we don't actually have any users, and I'm just going to return out of here. Append the user to the list of users. Existing users dot push username password. Write the list of users back to the file. This is going to be fs.writeFileSync. We already have our path name. It is the what do we call it? Users data file. And now, because existing users is an object and we need to write a string, we're going to use json.stringify existing users. And then I'm going to skip the second parameter, the third one. I'm going to put 4. This is the spacing or tabs. All right, so now, and I'll show you what that does in a second. So we go here, we create our user called post user. If we look at our users JSON, oh, it's added an empty, it's added a completely empty object. What happened there? Looks like our body didn't get something back. Okay, well, let's take a look at this. username, password. Let's just see what happened here. Put a little bit debug. We create our user. All right, you can see the body is undefined. Probably because I forgot to reload after I re-added the content type. If I go and look here, I can see my request headers. Yeah, its content type is text plain, which is not accurate. Let's just reload this. Create user again. There we go. Username, password, that's all set. I look in here. Now I can see that we have that appropriate username and that password. Let me get rid of this one. All right. What happens if we try to do it again? Error, user exists. Now it fails. So what do we want to do in that case of failure? What we actually want to do is we want to return a 409. What is a 409? A 409 is a specific status that tells us that there was an error because of a data conflict. That's very useful in this case because it's often used to say, hey, you told me to create this new object. We already created it. It already exists. So how do we do that? It has to do with the response. So we're going to say res for response, status, 409, and then res.end. We keep the return in here. Why? Because just calling res end, it doesn't actually mean the function finishes. It just means that the request is done, and we still want that function to terminate at this point so we don't continue on. Okay, let me actually take out my console log here. Restart the server. All right, so now if we call this, you can see we get a 409. It tells us status 409, and conflict, and we can use that to know, oh, this username already exists. Okay, let's do another user. Well, that one gives us a 200 OK. All right, I call it again on that same user, again a 409. Now we've got our two users in here. These are terrible names, but that's okay. So that is an example of how you would set up a post request from fetch. Now let's look at a get request. All right. Let's actually change our front end a little bit. So that I'm just going to put in a special thing here. It says button fetch all users. Right, equals get users. Kind of a dangerous thing to do in some cases, but that's okay. Go back to our script, make a new event listener, get element by ID, dot add event listener, click, and the function. We want to do another fetch request here. Fetch, the local host, remember the port, API user, but then we're just going to say, okay, then result, return result.json, pretty standard, right? Then data, and we're just going to console log the data. All right, but we're using the same exact APIs here. How can this be? Well, it's because APIs have two components, the method and the path. The path alone does not need to be unique. The method alone does not need to be unique. The path and method do. So in this case, fetch defaults to a get request. So if I go ahead and reload this and I click fetch all users, you can see its method is get. And it also is a 404. So how do I handle that? Well, I can say app down here, app.get, and then the path. API.user, oops. Right? User, okay, I put user here. Our second parameter, request response. All right, and we're just going to say res.end to start off with. Kill this. We go here, we click fetch all users, and now it gives us 200 OK with no response. The get request, it's hitting this method now. So that's the thing. These are the same exact paths, but the one is a post and one is a get, which corresponds to the post here, and the get, which fetch uses by default here. So that's how you add methods into this stuff, right? Okay, so what are we actually doing here? Well, we probably want to get the user list, right? So I'm actually just going to grab this code here, steal it, get our user list. Okay, and now the existing users, let's just send that up. So we can say res.json and pass in an object, and that actually causes it to get sent to the client. You can do this on post requests as well. Let's restart this. Okay, if we call fetch all users, now if we look, we actually have a response in here. This is the data that we got back. You can see in response, this is the raw data. In preview, you can see the JSONified data. And if you look at our response headers, the content type is application JSON, so that the browser knows it needs to treat it like JSON. If we look in our console log, it's not valid JSON, that's fun. Then you can see here's our stuff. Okay, but one thing to bear in mind is we got the password in there. The password's not super safe to send up like this. So what we can say is we can say users without password equals existing users.map. Now what does map do? It goes over every single element of the array and builds a new array from whatever we return out of the function. So what we're going to do is we're going to say new user equals, and we're just going to spread the user. Then we're going to delete, or we're going to say new user.password equals null, and we're going to return new user. And then we're going to actually JSON users without password. What this does is it makes a copy of the user object, blanks out the password, and returns that. So this list becomes a list of users that have that field blanked. Run this again. Fetch all users. And there you can see we have the username. The password is still in there as null. There's a way we get rid of it, but at least it's blanked now, which is a little bit safer. So that's pretty much how you do APIs. Very, very quick overview of them. They're not super complicated. Basically, whatever you put in this function gets called whenever you fetch that specific API. Fetch by default does a get. So we've got a get here. You can also tell it to do a post. And then that will be post. There's other methods, but they work in the same exact way. Post has a body. When you pass a body, you need to put a content type on it. And if you're using JSON, you have to put this middleware, or else Express doesn't know how to handle it. If you're doing cores and you're having cores issues, then you use this particular middleware. Okay, so what we've done here is we've got our file here. There's also a way to make Express be able to handle this stuff. So if we go to like localhost 3001, just like that, it says, hey, cannot get / There's nothing there. We get a 404. There's a number of reasons why this might be useful. For one, if the domain matches the API, we don't need cores. So remember, we had to put cores in here because we're using file and localhost. We won't need cores if the domain matches. The other is that if the domain matches, we actually don't need this either. So we can just put it like that, which is kind of handy. The third becomes a little bit more apparent when we start working with Webpack. So what we can do there is we can actually use a static. So we can say, okay, app.use express.static. What does that mean? That tells Express these are all static files that might have to do with the front end, and we need to just display these without doing anything weird. We need to give it a path. So in this case, we would say path.resolve dir name, which remembers our current name. We go up a directory, and then we go into front end. So that tells it these two files should be served by static, and it just automatically makes get methods for them. So what we can do now, this starts up. Now instead of opening that file, we can go here, and you can see it loads the same thing. Ignore the fav icon. That's fine. Fetch all users, that still works. We can get rid of cores now. And if we get rid of cores and rerun this, it still works because the domains are now the same. So that's one benefit of using express.static, even when you're developing, is that you don't need to put cores in for a file. The other thing is we can now get rid of this whole thing. Why is that useful? Well, let's say we actually need to launch this to production to a Heroku instance. We don't want this to be in here because Heroku is not going to be running at localhost and it's not going to be running on this port. So if we get rid of this, the browser will just automatically default to whatever domain you have. So it means we run, oops, actually let's do this one because this is the one we can call more easily. I hit this, I hit fetch all users, it still does its thing. If I go to network, it's actually automatically filled in this part. Let's say I change the port now. I run this on port. Well, let's look at the old one, right? Let's say I change my port to 3002. Okay. Well, if I go to 3002 now, it still loads fine, but when I fetch, it doesn't work. It fails because that port's not listening. I forgot to update here. But if I remove this and I reload, I can just fetch. I can change the port back to 3001. Load this. Oops. Fetch again. It still works. I mean, it gave me a 304 because the response didn't change. But it still works because if you just put this slash here, the browser kind of assumes that this is what you're hitting. And so that's another nice benefit of using the Express static middleware to actually load your page as opposed to just opening the file directly. Anyway, there's a bunch of other stuff that you can do with routes, but this covers the very basics of it. So I hope it was helpful.